The United States of America has had clear and consistent growth throughout its history. And while this continues through today, there are many cities in the US that are much smaller than they once were. And while they do remain, they consist of a very different landscape than they once had, making for some of the most vacated places in the entire country. These areas consist of brownfields, urban prairies, much blight, and abandonment, due to the fact that while the people have left, many buildings and industrial scars are left behind. These are 4 of the most vacated cities in America. First, we have Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a city that has lost 73.33% of its peak population. This city has lost so many people that it is smaller today than it was in 1890. Johnstown would be one of the early steel hubs of the Rust Belt, growing heavily off its proximity to natural resources in the area, most notably iron ore and coal. It would grow heavily in the late 1800s, anchored by its Cambria ironworks, and while it would have major issues with flooding over the years, it would peak at over 67,000 people in the 1920 census, and its population would remain relatively stable over the next 3 decades. However, as time passed, Johnstown would lose out to other areas of the Rust Belt in steel production. It would become so dependent on its steelworks, with over 11,000 people working for Bethlehem Steel there in the early 1970s, that when that faltered from the 70s to the early 1990s, there was nothing to replace the jobs with. Combine that with cratering coal production in the latter half of the 20th century in Pennsylvania, and you have a city that is one of the most vacated in the country. The city has over 500 abandoned properties and really does look a lot larger than it actually is, as today it has just under 18,000 residents and still dropping. There really is no silver bullet here to bring the city back either, as it is in a relatively remote area and will likely never return even close to the size it once was. Next we have East St. Louis, Illinois, which has lost 79.6% of its population from when it peaked in the 1950 census at over 82,000. This city would see its initial high growth in the late 1800s off of being a rail hub, being the terminus of multiple railroads. This, combined with having coal nearby, would make East St. Louis ripe for growth. Meatpacking and manufacturing would also become central to East St. Louis's growth, and its population would roughly quadruple from 1890 to 1910. And while the city would have its issues with racial tension with the riots of 1917, its population would continue to grow all the way to the 1950 census. Despite being just across the river from the much larger St. Louis, the city in and of itself would employ over 10,000 people at its businesses, despite the population of East St. Louis itself never exceeding much more than 82,000. This would not last though, as from about 1960 onward, almost everything would go wrong for the city. Company after company would leave the city, and crime would become some of the highest in the United States. Thousands upon thousands would leave the city each decade to a point where just over 17,600 remain. There are almost 700 abandoned homes in the city and a nearly 25% vacancy rate among all buildings. Aside from a casino by the riverfront, there really isn't much here, and you are left with a city that is just a fifth the size of what it once was. Moving on, we have Youngstown, Ohio. This city has lost 65.23% since its peak in population in the 1930 census. This city, roughly halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, was a steel hub in its heyday, and it would experience massive growth from 1860 to 1930, going from 2,769 to just over 170,000 people in that time period. Like Johnstown, proximity to coal would be imperative in the early growth of the city, enabling it to become a steel hub. Youngstown Sheet and Tube alone would employ 20,000 people at one point, and the Mahoning Valley was essentially covered in steel mills stretching for miles, whether it was Youngstown Sheet and Tube, U.S. Steel, or several others. The presence of all of these steel mills would make Youngstown an important rail hub as well. However, despite relatively holding up in population until the 1960 census, the 1970s would hit the city hard. This would be when the loss of steel jobs would be the most severe. On what became known as Black Monday in 1977, 5,000 jobs were lost from Youngstown Sheet and Tube alone. The area would lose thousands upon thousands of steel jobs in the late 1970s and into the 80s, and the population numbers would respond. There would end up being thousands of abandoned homes in Youngstown due to the steadiness and speed of job losses and population decline. There were so many abandoned homes that 7,000 have been torn down since 2007, with several hundred being demolished almost every year from then through 2024. This isn't even including the miles of brownfields and abandoned industrial areas left by the mills. Today, its population sits at less than half of what it once was, and is an example of what can happen to an essentially one industry city. Lastly, we have Highland Park, Michigan. This city, nearly surrounded by the city of Detroit, has seen a fate much like Detroit, if not worse. This city has lost 84.06% of its population from its peak in the 1930 census. Ford and Chrysler both would anchor this city, with Chrysler being headquartered there and Ford having a massive assembly plant there. The growth of Highland Park in the early 20th century was simply astounding. It would go from having 427 people in 1900 to around 46,500 in 1920, a roughly 100-fold increase in population in just 20 years. There were as many as 70,000 people alone working at the Highland Park Ford plant at one point, more than the entire population of Highland Park at any point in time in the city's history. Production at the Ford plant would wind down over the years until it would completely end in the 1970s, and eventually the plant would be sold in the early 1980s. While this and the overall decline of Detroit would have a major impact on Highland Park, the city still had Chrysler to hold it up, until it didn't. In 1992, Chrysler, like many of the residents of Detroit had been doing, moved to the suburbs. Thousands of jobs would be relocated to the outer suburb of Auburn Hills, Michigan, and it would hurt Highland Park severely in terms of tax revenues. The financial fallout from this would be so severe that Highland Park's finances would be turned over to the state of Michigan for much of the 2000s decade. While the city was losing population before this, population losses have remained steady through today. Even though there are only 8,443 people left as of 2023, Highland Park ranks among the most dangerous cities in America. While there are still some large employers within the city limits, the city is covered in well over 1,000 empty lots and truly is one of the most astonishing cases of the vacating of a sizable city in U.S. history. Cities rise and fall, but what is left behind after they fall can last long after the people have left. When what is left still remains, it serves as a lasting reminder of past prosperity and as a visual reminder of what happens when a place becomes one of the most vacated in America. Thank you for watching.